Hey guys, this is Norman over with SoundTraxx, and today we're going to be upgrading this Broadway Limited Centipede to the Tsunami 2. So let's get started. In front of us here, we have the BLI Baldwin Centipede. But before we actually get into the install, let's just go over real quick what we're going to need. So first off, obviously we're going to need a soldering iron. We're going to need flux. We're going to need side cutters. We're going to need an X-Acto knife. We're going to need wire strippers. We're going to need a small screwdriver. We're going to need some tweezers. We're going to need some Kapton tape. We're going to need an LED tester. Obviously, we're going to need solder. We're also going to need some shrink tube. We're going to need a couple of resistors. And of course, we're going to need our decoder, in this case the TSU-1100 for Baldwin and others, as well as two 15mm round speakers. So, to get started, we're going to need to take the shell off the model. It's secured to the model by 3 clips along either side. So there's one here, and one here. And they're mirrored on the other side as well. And you're going to need to use something to get those clips apart to get the shell off. So I'm just going to do that real quick and we'll be right back. With the shell now off, we're just going to set it to the side for the moment. And what we're going to want to do now is, as you can see, I've already removed the original decoder. There are 2 screws here and here that will hold it in place, and then it's just 2 plugs to remove it. So what we're going to want to do now is we're going to want to actually cut off said plugs. Like so, because we're actually going to reuse some of this wiring. Not all of it. So what we're going to want to do is start to untangle said wiring. So we're going to want to remove this tape, and it can go away. And that will allow us to finish untangling all of this wiring. So these are two of our pickups. Those are the other 2. We're going to reuse those. These are the lighting wires. We're going to reuse some of these. All of this speaker wiring, we're probably going to reuse some of it, but not all of it, and you'll see why in a minute. The motor wiring here we're not going to reuse. So let's start taking this apart even further. So first we're going to remove these speaker baffles. And this one is held in place by 2 clips here on the bottom. So we're just going to pop that out. And this also gives us access to our lighting wiring, but that's not what we're after for the minute. We're also going to remove this little metal weight on top of the motor here. And you can just do that by pressing against these clips. And that'll just allow this piece to come free. And we're doing that because we are actually going to remove the wires going to the motor. So we're going to want to take our soldering iron, just carefully remove the 2 motor wires. All right. So with that done, what we're going to end up doing is we're actually going to end up cutting these wires short, but we're going to leave them alone for the minute. The first thing we need to actually work on is the speakers, because we're actually going to replace these speakers since each of these are 100 ohm speakers. We could reuse them, but we're not going to get the best audio quality, so we're actually going to end up replacing them with our own 15mm speakers, 2 of them. So we're going to want to get these out of their packaging. All right, now we have these out of their packaging. So what we're going to want to do is remove the two original speakers. Now the trick here is that these guys are fairly well stuck in. So it may take a little bit of force to remove them. And we're also going to want to remove the gasket that the baffle sits on. And again at the front. Actually, that one we may be able to reuse. And then both speakers just come out. Now the tricky part here is we're going to want to wire our two new speakers in series, which means we're going to want to save one of these wires because they are long enough to run that full length. And in this case, I'm actually just going to desolder both. Like so. All right. So now we have wires long enough to run between our two speakers. So at this point, we're actually just going to want to solder one of these. And what we're going to want to do is take just a little bit of flux, put it on there. We're going to want to get some solder on the tip of our iron. And then just solder speaker wire to the speaker like so. Now you'll notice I did this on the left side, and now I'm going to solder this wire to the right side of the second speaker. And this is because these are both 8 ohm speakers, so we're going to wire them in series. And the second joint is done. So these are going to end up sitting in the model. Now at this point, the other thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to use our Kapton tape in order to secure these speakers, because you'll notice they are quite a bit smaller than the original speakers here. So what we're going to do, we're going to want to take a length of our Kapton tape. We're going to want to cut it just so that it's easier to work with. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a piece of it and run it over the speaker. And we're just going to tape it down like so. And then we use our X-Acto knife to cut off the excess. We're going to do the same thing, cutting off the tape on the other side. So that first speaker is now secured, and we're going to do the same thing to our second speaker. Now both of our speakers are secured. Now at this point, we're going to want to get our decoder out, because we're going to want to start soldering up our speaker wires before we close the baffles on our two speakers. So the decoder is going to end up sitting right here on top of our rear baffle. So we're going to need to route one of our wires underneath said baffle. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our baffle, We're going to measure that wire to length with a little bit of extra, and we're going to cut it about where we think we're going to need it. And we're just going to set the remaining wire to the side. Now at this point we're going to want to strip and tin the end of this wire. So we're going to take our wire strippers, and we're going to pull a small length of that off. We're going to take our flux, we're going to put a little bit on the end of that wire, and we're going to take our soldering iron, we're going to get a little bit of solder on the end of it, and we're just going to touch it to the end of the wire, and that will tin the wire in question. Also going to want to get a little bit of flux on the pad on the speaker. We're just going to take our tweezers, we're going to use them to hold that wire in place while we solder speaker wire to the speaker, like so. So with our wires placed, we're going to want to now put the baffle back. One thing that we're going to want to make sure of is that the two wires running there to the gap in the baffle where the wires come out, we're going to want to make sure they aren't pinched under this screw when we put it down. But I've already checked that and they're fine. So now our decoder is going to sit right there. So now we're going to need to secure our decoder. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually to make sure that these little pegs here on the baffle are gone so that they don't interfere with the mounting. So not all of these wires are actually going to be used. So we're actually going to cut some of these short, like our green and our brown wire here. And we're just going to want to cut them about to the length of the decoder, because we're going to use the Kapton tape that we're using to mount the decoder to keep those wires in check as well. And we're going to end up installing our capacitor, so we're going to leave the green and yellow wire out as well. And all the rest of these on the front here are going to end up being used. So we're going to want to take our purple wire, which is still at full length to reach the other speaker at the front, as well as our green, brown, and the black wire from the first speaker. And we're going to want to try and get them to run along the length of the decoder like that. So once we've got our wires to lie flat here, we're going to want to make sure the decoder is where we want it, just above the baffle. And I'm going to take this length of Kapton tape that I have pre-cut and use it to secure all these wires and the decoder in place. Okay, that is a little bit too far forward because it's actually going to interfere with the placement of the shell. So we're actually going to take this and move it just a bit farther backwards. Right there looks good. All right. So with that placed, we can again just trim the excess on the Kapton tape. All right. Next up, the first thing we're going to want to do is to connect the motor. For this purpose, we're going to want to separate out our orange and our gray wires from the decoder. And we're going to want to also make sure of the polarity of our motor. So for this purpose, I actually have an LED tester here, but I've also fitted a third wire to it, which allows me to get the 9 volts out, and I can use this 9 volts to figure out in what polarity does my motor spin in forward. So with this, I've already determined that this lead here to the motor is going to want to be my negative, and this lead here is going to want to be my positive. If you get this wrong, don't worry, your motor's just going to spin backwards and you'll need to re-solder it. But thanks to the use of my little motor tester, I don't have to do that. So I can just take my gray wire here and cut it to length, and then do the same thing with my orange wire and just cut it to length. And we're going to set all this off to the side. Now, like before, we're going to take these two and we're going to strip and tin the ends. So we're going to take our wire strippers, strip a little bit off the end. Same thing for the gray wire. Take our flux, just put a little on the end. Get solder, put it on the tip of our iron, and just touch tip of the iron, the bit that we stripped. And that's it. Now we're going to want to apply some flux to our motor terminals. Get our tweezers, and we're just going to want to solder gray wire there like so. And on the other side, the orange wire like so. And that's our motor done. So at this point, we can now put that top weight we removed back on. But what we're gonna want to do is we're actually going to want to make sure our leads come out like that, so that this can sit flush, just like so. All right, so with that done, we're going to want to move on to our pickups. And for this, we're going to want to use the red and the black wire from our decoder. So we're going to want to separate these out, like so. And the rest of these wires can go over there for the moment. Now remember, earlier I had very specifically noted we were going to save the original pickup wires. And this is where that comes into play. So what we're going to want to do is take these and sort of measure out about where they're going to intersect. And considering we're going to run these backwards, that's going to end up being right about there. So we're going to cut them a little bit long. And then we're going to cut the black wire from our decoder to meet them. And we're going to strip and tin all three of these. So I'm going to do that and rejoin you shortly. So with all three of those wires stripped and tinned, we're now going to want to cut a small piece of shrink tubing, like so. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to solder all three of these wires together. So we're going to put our shrink tubing on and try and pull it as far down these wires as you can. now going to do is we're going to solder all 3 of these wires together. So we're just going to get a little bit more flux. That's probably more than I needed. We're going to get some more solder on our soldering iron. And we just hold all 3 wires. We are going to slide the shrink tube over that joint. Now we're going to hold our soldering iron near it to shrink down the shrink tube, like so. So now we're going to do the same procedure to the other side. Alright, so with this second pickup wire all done, we can go ahead and move on to our second speaker wire. So remember how we separated this earlier? Well, now it's time to run it all the way over here. And we're going to want to leave some excess room. And we're going to want to trim this wire like so. And again, we're going to want to strip it to the end. Now we're going to want to put some flux on the speaker pad down there. We're going to use our tweezers and solder our second speaker wire just like that. Now at this point we can refit our second baffle. Now all these wires that we found earlier are going to want to run up, and there's a small space just at the top of this baffle here for those wires to escape. So we're going to want to make sure that all 4 of our lighting wires go through that hole like so. Now we can just go ahead and put this baffle back in place, just like that. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to actually trim these short. So right about there should be enough. I've taken the liberty of stripping and tinning the ends of these wires here, and what we're going to want to do now is take some small pieces of shrink tube, 2 to be precise, and we're going to want to put 1 on each of the 2 black wires coming from the front here. So using our the LED tester, I know that this black wire is for our headlight and this one is for our number boards. So we're going to take our white and our yellow wires from our decoder. Now the yellow wire is typically the backup light, but because this model doesn't have a backup light, I'm actually going to repurpose it for our number boards. And what we'll want to do is take our white wire and our yellow wire and trim them to length. Now at this point we're also going to take our 2 resistors and we're going to get some solder on the end of our soldering iron. Get some flux on the end of these wires and put one resistor on each wire. Just like so. So this is where that shrink tube we placed on these wires earlier comes into play. You can see I've already done one. And what we're going to want to do is take our shrink tube, pull it up over our joint, and just shrink it down. Now we can cut the leads to the resistor on the other side as well. We're going to want to get 2 more pieces of shrink tube. And place them on our yellow wire. And our white wire. So using our LED tester, we know that this one is for number boards, which we're going to actually reuse our yellow wire. Now, this is typically our backup light, but in this case, we don't have a backup light, so I'm going to repurpose it for our number boards. And with our connection soldered, we can now go ahead, slide the shrink tube over, and shrink it down. Like so. We're going to do the same thing with our white wire. And we're going to connect it to our headlight. Like so. And again, we're going to slide our shrink tube over and shrink it down. And that's our resistors installed, and that's our negative leads connected to the lights. So now all that's left to do is to connect the blue wire, our common positive, to these 2 positive wires from our lights. So we're going to cut our blue wire to length, put the excess aside, we're going to tin it. We're going to put some shrink tube on. All right, so now all we have to do is connect the 2 positives from our headlight and number board to the blue common from the decoder. You can see I've already placed a piece of shrink tube on the blue wire. All right, and with that joint done, all we need to do now is slide the shrink tube over, and shrink it down. And now we're done. So all we want to do now is take this little section here and put a small piece of Kapton tape over it, just to make sure that those wires are secure and not going anywhere. And with all of our wiring secure, we can go ahead, take our X-Acto, and cut the excess from the Kapton tape. And like that, we're done. So we can simply place the shell back on top, make sure all of our clips are in, and let's go try it out. So now that we've got the installation completed, let's actually go ahead and try it out here. So if I unmute it, you can see that we have sound. We have lights, both headlight and number boards. Yep. And it does indeed move in both directions. So, we still have a few things to do before we can call this one officially set up. So, first off, we're going to need to select our prime mover. In this case, we're going to want to select the 608NA. And with the prime mover selected, we're also going to want to go through and set up the number boards, since we put those on the tail light output. So in order to do that, first, we're going to need to go in and make sure that it's enabled in the forward direction. So to do that, we're going to want to go to CV57, and we're going to want to set it to 63. And what this does is this re-enables the tail light as a non-directional output. And since both the tail light and headlight are already mapped to F0, both lights, the headlight and the number boards, are now going to come on at the same time. However, when I put the locomotive into reverse, the headlight goes out, but the number boards do not. And of course, you can remap this function and put it wherever you want to. Well, we've gone over a few of the options you may want to set up on your Baldwin Centipede. There are, of course, several others. Obviously, the various Tsunami 2 features like the dynamic digital exhaust and the 7-band equalizer, as well as setting up your horn and your bell and your air compressor. If you have more questions about this installation, you feel free to contact us at support@SoundTraxx.com. Download the user's guides for information on how to set up your Tsunami 2. And be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you get notified the next time we upload a video.